This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. There are places scrubbed from the map, not because they are empty, but because they are occupied by things that refuse to be forgotten. In the tradition of Kaidan, these stories walk the narrow ridge between our world and the one that watches from the shadows. Here, names are debts, and the woods always keep a meticulous tally. As you listen, pay close attention to the silence. Sometimes, the most unsettling truths aren't what we see, but what is added to the count when we aren't looking. Chapter 1. The Night of the Substitution. The hamlet had a name that didn't appear on any modern map. Or rather, it used to, but it had been scrubbed away over time. Now, any mail meant for the place had to be routed through the neighboring town's post office. "Are you sure people actually live out here?" Kevin, my junior assistant, asked as he stared out the passenger window. The road was paved but narrow, winding precariously along the edge of the slope without a single guardrail. Even though it was only late afternoon, the shadows of the peaks had already swallowed the road, plunging us into a premature twilight. "They live here, or at least there are signs that they did," I replied, keeping my hands steady on the wheel. "We were here for a site survey. That was the official reason the university's regional history department had sent us out to this remote corner of the mountains." At the entrance to the settlement stood a small stone marker. The inscription had long since weathered away, but the surface was covered in countless strange gouges. "Looks like someone hammered on it," Kevin remarked. "Maybe," I said, but I knew better. Those weren't hammer marks. The stone had been worn down by the touch of 1,000 frantic hands. There were only 7 houses in the entire clearing. Only one looked like it might still be inhabited. When I knocked on the heavy wooden door, there was a long silence before a voice drifted from inside. "Who's there?" It was an older woman's voice. "We're from the university," I called out. "We're conducting a survey on the history and traditions of this area." The door creaked open just a fraction. The woman peered at us, her eyes scanning our faces before she spoke softly. "Not tonight." Her voice didn't carry the tone of a simple refusal. It was the word "tonight" that felt heavy, like a warning. "We can come back another time then," I started to say, but her gaze shifted to something behind me. 2 outsiders on the night of the substitution. I heard Kevin catch his breath. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I had. The woman didn't close the door. Instead, she turned and began walking deeper into the house. "If you're coming in, do it quickly." There was an intensity in her voice that made it impossible to walk away. The inside of the house was meticulously kept. It felt sterile, devoid of the clutter of daily life, and there wasn't a speck of dust to be seen. "Tonight is the night of the substitution," the woman said, sitting down across from the stone hearth. "Substitution? You mean like a change in leadership?" Kevin asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes," she replied, tossing a fresh log onto the fire. "A change in the guard. Long ago, this village was protected by the woods, but protection came with a price, a promise. What kind of promise? I asked. One person from one house is returned to the woods on the night of the substitution. I struggled to grasp her meaning, but she pressed on. Returned doesn't mean killed. That denial only made my skin crawl. It means they take up the mantle. The fire popped, sending sparks dancing into the chimney. Those who take up the mantle become part of the wood's tally. The tally? The woman looked at us directly for the first time. The woods keeps account of the souls within it. Kevin let out a nervous laugh. You're joking, right? If it were a joke, this village wouldn't be a ghost town, she snapped. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Some tried to run. They tried to leave the ridge on the night of the substitution. She reached for an old, leather-bound ledger resting near the hearth. But those who fall out of the count are always brought back. She opened the cover. The pages were filled with names, written in dense, cramped script. These names, I felt the air leave my lungs. The last few pages were a mess of ink, with the same names scrawled over and over, one on top of the other. Because they were brought back, she said tonelessly. Their forms might change, but they are returned to the woods to fill the count. Kevin's voice trembled. You mean they aren't human anymore? Yes, and that is why the village kept up the substitution for so long. She closed the book. But during one exchange, no one went to the woods. I felt a cold dread pull in my stomach. Everyone ran, she whispered. The fire in the hearth suddenly flickered and dimmed. The woods lost its count. She stood up slowly. And so, the woods began its own reckoning to balance the numbers. Her eyes moved from me to Kevin, then back again. Tonight is that night. Kevin scrambled to his feet, his legs shaking. This is crazy. I'm leaving. He turned to bolt for the door, but at that exact moment, a sound came from outside. A heavy, wet, dragging noise against the dirt. The collectors are here for the substitution, the woman said. Through the gap in the door, shadows began to stretch across the floor. There wasn't just one. The count is short, after all. With those final words, the fire went out completely. In the pitch black, Kevin screamed, "David, there's someone else in here." His voice cut off mid-sentence. The next morning, I was found alone on the main road at the base of the mountain. The path leading to the settlement was gone, missing from the maps, and nowhere to be found in the physical world. The only thing I had left was a scrap of paper in my pocket. My name was written on it, over and over, the ink bleeding together. The count will be maintained until the next substitution. Chapter 2. The Drift. The Drift. My dad has one particular story he tells every time he's had a few too many. It happened about 25 years ago, back when he was in his early 30s. Dad was obsessed with sailing, but he didn't own a boat of his own yet, so he spent his weekends hitching rides with friends. When the 4th of July rolled around, he had over a week off work and was itching to get out on the water. Right on cue, a guy from his office named Hank invited him on a trip. Hank was a high-level executive in a different department, well into his 50s, but he and my dad were close because of their shared hobby. Hank owned a massive, beautiful yacht that our families used to take out together all the time. This time, Hank invited our whole family for a long-distance cruise, but my mom and I already had plans to go camping with some family friends. Hank's own family was busy too, and he and my dad agreed that a trip with just the two of them might be a little dull. That was when Jake, a junior associate and another sailing nut, overheard them and asked if he could bring a couple of friends along. Jake had been sailing since high school and had even taken out a loan for his own racing boat the second he started working. He was a hardcore sailor, usually more interested in competitive racing than the lazy cruising my dad and Hank enjoyed, but he was in a bind. Two of his buddies wanted him to take them out deep-sea fishing, but Jake's boat was a cramped racing vessel, not built for comfort or for a single person to manage two amateurs. He begged to tag along on Hank's yacht instead. Hank was an easygoing guy and told him to bring them along. The five of them sat down, mapped out a route to a place they called Blackwood Island, and planned to hit several of Hank's favorite fishing spots along the way. They stocked up on a mountain of beer and snacks and set sail. The weather was perfect. The forecast called for nothing but clear skies, and the fishing was the best any of them had ever seen. They were trawling for tuna and mackerel, catching so many it felt like the fish were practically jumping into the boat. Jake's friends were having the time of their lives. They reached Blackwood Island ahead of schedule and spent 2 days hiking and fishing, but eventually the heat and the activity started to wear them out. They decided to head back a day early. Since they were making such good time, Hank suggested they stop at a tiny, secluded spot called Shell Key. My dad remembered it from a previous trip. It was a beautiful little place with crystal clear water and a couple of seasonal burger shacks by the pier. But when they pulled into the cove, the place was a ghost town. The shacks were boarded up and there wasn't another boat in sight. "Looks like we're early for the season," Hank said, sounding disappointed. But since they were already there, they decided to drop anchor and have one last fishing session, followed by a feast. They spread out across the deserted island to find their own spots, and the fishing turned out to be legendary. My dad is the most impatient man on earth with zero natural talent for the sport, but even he was pulling them in. Within 3 hours, their coolers were overflowing. Around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, they decided to cook an early dinner before heading home. They whipped up a massive seafood spread on the deck and started drinking. They spent hours laughing, trading stories about work, their kids, and the sea. My dad loves a drink, but he's a lightweight. At some point, he drifted off in his deck chair. When he jerked awake, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a faint, ghostly glow reflecting off the water. He scrambled up, realizing he'd slept longer than intended. Hank and Jake were both slumped over the table on deck, fast asleep with glasses still in their hands. Jake's 2 friends had crawled into the cabin to sleep. Dad chuckled to himself, figuring he should wake them up so they could start the engine and get home. Just as he reached out to shake Hank's shoulder, a loud, heavy splash erupted from the stern of the boat. Startled, Dad hurried to the railing. It was too dark to see clearly, but something was churning the water. He grabbed a flashlight and clicked it on. A massive school of squid was swarming white against the hull, dancing in the light. They were so close and so thick that Dad thought he could probably just scoop them up. He grabbed a long-handled dip net, leaned over the back, and plunged it into the swarm. The net felt incredibly heavy. When he hauled it up, 5 large squid were pulsing inside. Dad let out a surprised shout, which finally woke Hank and Jake. They stumbled over to the stern, rubbing their eyes. When Dad showed them the bucket of squid, Hank's eyes lit up. "Let me try that," he said, taking the net. As Dad and Jake stood by, joking about who was the better fisherman, a massive thud shook the boat, followed by a sickeningly loud splash. Dad spun around. Hank was gone. The school of squid had vanished instantly. Dad wasn't worried at first. He figured Hank had just leaned too far and slipped. Hank was a strong swimmer, and the water in the cove was dead calm. He expected the older man to pop up and start cursing any second. But when Hank finally surfaced, he was nearly 15 feet away from the boat, thrashing violently. Dad instinctively started to kick off his shoes to dive in, but Jake grabbed his arm with terrifying strength. "No," Jake hissed, his face pale and twisted with fear. "Use the life ring. Pull him in." Dad thought jumping in would be faster, but there was something in Jake's voice, a raw, primal panic, that made him stop. He grabbed the orange life ring from the railing and hurled it toward Hank. It landed right next to him. Hank grabbed it like a drowning man, and Dad and Jake began to haul the rope. It was like a tug of war. Even though Hank was trying to swim toward them, the rope was taut, as if he were being pulled by a current. But there was no current in the cove. The water around Hank was boiling with strange, localized ripples, like something was circling him just beneath the surface. Jake screamed for his friends in the cabin. Mark and Steve came running out, half drunk and confused, but they jumped on the rope too. It took all 4 of them pulling with everything they had to drag Hank back to the side of the yacht. "Are you okay?" Dad yelled as they hauled him over the rail. Hank was gasping for air, his face a mask of pure terror. "Get us out of here," he roared. His voice was so loud it seemed to echo off the trees on the shore. That was the signal. Jake sprinted to the bow to cast off the lines, while Hank scrambled to the helm and killed the anchor. He gunned the engine with a reckless fury that was completely unlike him, tearing the yacht away from the pier. As they sped out of the cove, Dad started to hear it, a deep, guttural croaking sound. It sounded like a bullfrog, but it had a heavy, wet, human quality to it, like a man trying to moan through a throat full of water. The sound followed them, echoing across the dark waves, even after they cleared the inlet. Dad turned to ask Hank what had happened, but Jake beat him to it. His voice was trembling. "I saw them," he whispered. "When Hank fell in, I saw things in the water." He explained that when the flashlight hit the water around Hank, he saw multiple shapes. They were the size of small children, but they were a sickly, translucent white. When Dad had moved to jump in, those things had all turned their heads at once to look at him. Their eyes didn't just reflect the light, they glowed a piercing, predatory red. "I can't see them anymore," Jake said, staring back at the receding island. "But I can feel them. They're still with us." Dad asked if anyone else heard the croaking sound. Everyone nodded in grim silence. Hank finally spoke, his voice tight and bitter. "Something pulled the end of that net," he said. "It dragged me right over the rail. And when I tried to swim back, I couldn't see anything, but I felt hands. Dozens of cold, slimy hands grabbing my ankles and my arms, trying to pull me down." The 5 of them sat in a heavy, suffocating silence as the yacht raced toward the mainland. The strange croaking sound continued to drift up from the dark water behind the boat. Dad couldn't explain why, but his eyes kept drifting to the bucket of squid he'd caught. A sudden, overwhelming urge took hold of him. He picked up the bucket, walked to the railing, and looked out at the black sea. "I'm sorry," he whispered under his breath. "We shouldn't have taken these." He dumped the squid back into the ocean. A few seconds later, the croaking stopped. The oppressive feeling of being watched lifted instantly. The men looked at each other, and a few of them let out shaky, nervous laughs of relief. They reached the harbor in the middle of the night. None of them wanted to go home alone, so they all piled into a 24-hour truck stop nearby. They sat in a booth, shivering and nursing cups of black coffee, finally feeling like they were back in the world of the living. That was when Hank took off his soaked windbreaker and rolled up his sleeves. He showed them his arms and shoulders. He was covered in angry red welts, bruises and scratches that looked exactly like they had been made by small, 3-fingered hands. None of them ever went back to Shell Key. And to this day, my dad won't even eat calamari. Chapter 3. The Ledger of Names. In this town, you lose your name the moment you get married. Or more accurately, you're forced to choose a new one. Is it just me, or are there way too many different last names in this place? Mark, my junior associate, asked as he gripped the steering wheel. We were working as contractors for the county's Vital Records office, sent out to conduct a door-to-door census and verify property deeds. It was a strange assignment. We were looking at the same few families, yet every individual seemed to carry a completely different surname. The town's records were a chaotic mess of overlapping genealogies. Our goal was simple: settle the records for a district where the population was aging out and houses were falling into ruin. But when I'd taken the job, there was a bizarre stipulation attached to the contract. All marital status verifications must be performed in person, on site, with no exceptions. We met the town supervisor in a drafty, century-old municipal building. When we asked about the naming conventions, the man, a Mr. Henderson, let out a dry chuckle, though his eyes remained cold and fixed. "Outsiders always mention that," he said. "Under state law, of course, everyone has one legal name, but here things work a bit differently." He lowered his voice, the sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "In this valley, you don't just marry a person, you marry the graveyard." Mark cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. What is that supposed to mean? Henderson pointed to a faded sepia photograph hanging on the wood-paneled wall. It showed a group of men and women with strikingly similar facial features, but each one wore a heavy wooden placard around their neck with a different name burned into the grain. Long ago, the people who settled this land made a pact in exchange for staying here. The names are the deeds to the property. Or, to be more precise, the names are the marks the land uses to claim its owners. A chill crawled down my spine. "So when someone gets married, they're assigned a name?" I asked. Henderson nodded, and from that moment on, they become a permanent part of this town. I asked what happened if someone refused the arrangement. Henderson looked down, his expression unreadable. "Some have tried to refuse." Mark leaned forward, his curiosity getting the better of his nerves. "And what happened to them?" "Their seats remained filled," Henderson said flatly. I didn't understand what he meant. Even if the person is gone, the name remains. That night, we stayed at the only place in town a cramped and dusty bed and breakfast. "This place gives me the creeps," Mark said, staring at the ceiling from his twin bed. "All that talk about names being a trap, it's just local superstition." I didn't answer. I was busy looking over the ledgers again. There were hundreds of names, but no records of anyone actually dying. There were only entries for new names being established. The population wasn't growing, but the list of surnames was expanding every year. "It's like the people aren't increasing," I whispered. "Only the names are." Mark didn't respond. He had already drifted off into a fitful sleep. In the middle of the night, a sound in the hallway woke me. It was a heavy, rhythmic sliding noise, like something wet being dragged across the floorboards. "Is someone out there?" I called out. A woman's voice drifted through the bedroom door, thin and airy. "It's time to choose your name." Mark bolted upright, his eyes wide with terror. "Who is that?" he shouted. There was no reply. The next morning, Mark was gone. His bed was neatly made, but resting on the pillow was a single, official-looking document, a marriage license. The name listed in the section for the groom was one I had never seen before, a long, archaic-sounding name that bore no resemblance to Mark's. I ran back to the town hall, my heart hammering against my ribs. Henderson was waiting for me behind his desk. "It seems the contract has been settled," he said calmly. "Your friend has become a name." I slammed my hand on the desk. "Where is he? Where did you take him?" Henderson didn't flinch. "He has become part of the ledger. Now it's your turn. You haven't made your selection yet." He slowly pushed a massive, leather-bound book toward me. "Marriage in this valley isn't about choosing a partner," he said. "It is the act of deciding which name will be allowed to remain on this land." I looked down at the final page of the ledger. My breath hitched in my throat. There, at the very bottom of the list, written in faint, fresh ink that looked like it hadn't quite dried, was my own full name. "It's already started, isn't it?" I whispered. Henderson said nothing. He simply watched me with those dead, hollow eyes. As I fled the town and reached the main highway, I looked back at the welcome sign. Below the town's name, someone had added a small, hand-painted wooden plank. It read, "For those with names yet unclaimed." Chapter 4. The Surplus. The surplus. Anyone who ventures up into the ridge has to leave something behind. In this valley, that was just the way of things. I'd been contracted by the state to survey the old settlements deep in the wilderness, documenting the aftermath of the mudslides that had ravaged the area a decade ago. Since the big collapse 10 years back, the restricted zone had been expanded, and almost no one lived up there anymore. "The mountain isn't holding a grudge," said Elias, the last man still living in the hollow. "It's just that things haven't come back yet." He stopped at the edge of the settlement, right in front of a jagged, eroded slope. Past this point used to be the place for the returning. "The returning?" I asked, scribbling in my notebook. "You mean like returning what people took from the woods?" Elias nodded. "Whatever they brought back down with them." "Is it wood?" I asked. "Stones?" "Something lighter than that," he said, tapping his chest. "Not feelings, though." He shook his head. "It's the tally." It was a chilling way to put it. "When you go up into the ridge, you always come back with more than you started with," he continued. "Something extra." He wouldn't explain any further. According to the records I had, 3 workers had gone missing during the disaster 10 years ago. They were never found, right? I asked. Elias looked at the slope. Oh, the mountain took them all right. The way he said it made my skin crawl. That night, staying in a temporary trailer near the site, I read through some old local folklore. Anyone returning from the ridge brings back one extra thing. If they don't return it, the next person to go up has to carry it. It didn't make any sense to me. The next day, I went up to the site alone. Halfway up the slope, tucked between 2 massive fallen boulders, I found a small, weathered wooden box, a makeshift memorial. Inside, there weren't any offerings like flowers or candles. Instead, it was stuffed with lost items, work gloves, hard hats, boots. But the numbers were wrong. There was an extra boot, a left one with no pair. There were 3 hard hats, even though the memorial was for a 2-man crew. Surplus. Just then, I heard footsteps behind me. Did you come to return it? It was Elias. Return what? I asked. He looked down at my feet. That. My shadow was doubled. I looked at the ground, and my heart skipped a beat. There was definitely an extra shadow stretching out from my heels, a dark, jagged shape that didn't match my movements. You went up into the woods, didn't you? He asked. I did. Then you've increased. Elias stepped toward the wooden box. Return it, and you can go home. If you don't, it'll pass to the next person who walks these woods. Something inside the box seemed to shift. I watched, paralyzed, as a sliver of darkness seemed to peel away from my feet, sinking into the dirt like spilled ink before sliding toward the memorial. I couldn't even find my voice. Hurry, Elias urged. The ridge has already counted you. I forced myself to look away from the shadows and took a stumbling step toward the box. The moment I did, I felt a sudden lightness in my limbs, as if a heavy coat had been lifted from my shoulders. Behind me, I heard the sound of someone exhaling, a long, wet sigh. Not back yet, a low voice whispered. I didn't look back. I ran all the way down the mountain. A few days later, the recovery team finally located the remains of the workers who had gone missing 10 years ago. The official records stated that 3 men had disappeared, but when the coroner finished the report, they had found 4 bodies. The final line of the report read, "Surplus remains. Origin unknown." I haven't gone back to the mountains since. But even now, I find myself checking the ground whenever the sun is out. I count my shadows, making sure there is only ever one. Chapter 5. The Tally. In that town, you never count the children. The reason is simple. If the woods realize the count is short, they will come to fill the gap. I was sent there as a substitute teacher for a remote schoolhouse in the Blackwood district, a satellite campus that was slated to be shut down and consolidated into the main county system the following year. "How many students exactly?" the school district supervisor asked on my first day. "The roster says 12, I replied. "I see," he said. He didn't offer a correction or a warning. He just stared at me with a blank, hollow expression. The unease started during the morning assembly. As the children lined up in the yard, I did a quick mental count. 11. I blinked and checked again. There were definitely only 11. "Is someone absent today?" I asked. The children all turned to look at me at once. "We're all here," a small girl in the front row whispered. But please, don't count us." There was a strange, heavy maturity in her voice that didn't belong to a child. The classes were eerily quiet. The kids listened intently, and no one acted out or whispered. But during recess, they played the same strange game. They would stand in a circle and begin to count. 1, 2. They always stopped before the end. "That's everyone," someone would say, and they would immediately break the circle and walk away. I asked the old groundskeeper about it later that afternoon. "The children have a strange way of playing, don't they?" "It's no game," he snapped, not looking up from his rake. "It's a verification. They're checking to see if the count has dropped." That night, I looked over the class ledger in my cabin. 12 names were listed, but for one of them, there was no photo. The name was there, but the attendance record was a total blank. No marks for present, no marks for absent, just an empty white space. The next day, I slipped up. During a math lesson, I found myself counting the heads in the room out of habit. 1, 2, 3, 11. The air in the classroom curdled instantly. "Teacher," the girl from the day before said, standing up slowly, "you shouldn't have done that. You can't count us." Outside, the wind began to howl, a low, guttural moan that shook the window panes. "Now they'll say the count is short," she whispered. "Who?" I asked, my heart hammering. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the empty desk at the back of the room. For the first time, I felt a presence there, something that existed only because it hadn't been accounted for. After school, the groundskeeper caught me by the arm as I was leaving. "Leave tomorrow," he hissed, his eyes darting toward the tree line. "Get out before the numbers balance themselves." That night, I heard voices outside my cabin. 12. It was coming from the schoolyard. The counting didn't stop at 11 this time. 12. It wasn't a human voice. It was a low, rhythmic croak that sounded like it was being squeezed out of a wet throat. The next morning, there were 12 children standing in the yard. They were all perfectly still, facing the schoolhouse door. "It's okay now, teacher," the girl said as I approached. "The count is full." My eyes landed on one of them, a child I hadn't seen until that moment. The 12th child, the one with no photo in the ledger. He looked at me and gave a wide, knowing grin. "Next," he whispered, "it's your turn to be counted." Behind me, I heard something begin to tally. 1. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I left the district that morning and never looked back. To this day, the number of children in that town remains exactly 12. No one ever tries to count them to see if that's true. Chapter 6. The Midnight Drive. Back in college, a friend and I were out for a drive in the middle of the night. On a whim, we decided to head to a 24-hour diner in the next county over for some late-night burgers. And on the way back, we took an old mountain road that twisted and turned like a dying snake. I'd driven that route a few times during the day, but at night, the atmosphere was so oppressive I could hardly believe it was the same road. I was behind the wheel, but I've always been a bit of a jumpy person, so I would have much preferred to be in the passenger seat. My friend Ryan, however, had spent the entire time at the diner knocking back beers while I stuck to coffee, so he was in no condition to drive. Instead, he just sat in the passenger seat, tossing out irresponsible jokes and keeping up a constant stream of chatter. That was when he suddenly lowered his voice, his tone turning conspiratorial. "You know, people say some pretty weird stuff happens on this ridge." I'd never heard any rumors about the place, but I knew if I asked him what he meant, I'd be playing right into his hands. I pretended I wasn't interested and gave him a short, dismissive grunt. Ryan went quiet after that, staring down at his lap. It was a 2-lane road, but we hadn't seen a single oncoming car for miles. The occasional streetlight stood like a lonely sentinel, casting a weak, flickering glow that barely touched the pavement. As I drove through the silence, a massive silhouette suddenly loomed in the darkness ahead. My heart lurched, but as we passed it, I realized it was just one of those old weathered stone markers that sat along the shoulder. I remembered seeing them before, strange, hunched things that looked almost like people if you caught them at the wrong angle. Ryan finally broke the silence. "Hey, you want to hear a scary story?" I knew it. I figured he'd been sitting there cooking up some ghost story just to mess with me, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. "Fine," I said. "Go ahead." Ryan kept his head down, his voice low and rhythmic as he began to speak. "Apparently, there's something buried in the garden of my family's old house. My grandpa told me about it. You know how old our place is, right? Well, there's this strange stone in the corner of the yard. Nobody knows how long it's been there. And Grandpa said that something is buried right underneath it. He told me that whatever is under there has protected our family for generations. But the trade-off is that it's always angry. Always. That's why my grandparents are out there every single day, watering the stone and cleaning the area around it like it's a shrine. I always thought it was just some weird family tradition. But when I was a kid, I went to visit my great-grandpa in the hospital. He was bedridden and near the end. But when I asked him about the stone, he told me the same thing. He said he'd heard it from his own grandfather. To a kid, that felt like ancient history, so I just figured it had to be true. Ryan continued his story in a flat, emotionless drone. It was a bizarre tale to be telling on a dark mountain road. He shifted in his seat. You know how people think of house spirits as these cute little guardians, like brownies or something? But the idea of one being buried, that's the part that always bothered me. So I asked my great-grandpa. I asked him why it was buried. Just as he said that, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. I nearly yanked the steering wheel to the side, my tires screeching against the asphalt. The headlights only caught it for a split second, but it wasn't a person. It was another one of those stone markers. A cold shiver raced down my spine. That was impossible. We were on a one-way mountain pass, and I knew for a fact we'd already passed that marker. There was no way there were two of them that looked exactly the same. My great-grandpa closed his eyes and pressed his hands together like he was praying. Ryan whispered, seemingly oblivious to my panic. He told me that a long time ago, the head of our family brought a spirit into the house to bring us fortune. The family prospered, but the spirit was a restless thing. It wanted to leave. It wanted to go back to where it came from. So the head of the house took a blade and cut the spirit into pieces. He buried the parts in different corners of the property so it could never be whole again, and it could never leave. My head started to swim. I didn't know where I was anymore. The scenery hadn't changed, the same dense trees pressing in from both sides, but it felt like we should have cleared the ridge 10 minutes ago. What was that stone marker? I didn't remember there being two. The road seemed to be squirming in front of the headlights, twisting away from us like it was trying to lead us somewhere else. Ryan kept talking, his head still bowed. Ever since then, the family stayed wealthy, but we were cursed in other ways. People died young. Sickness followed us. Great-grandpa said the spirit brings fortune, but it's also a god of grudges that wants to tear the family out by the roots. That's why we have to keep that stone clean, to keep its anger from boiling over. Cut it out, Ryan, I snapped. We're going to get lost. I felt like we were driving in circles, but the road didn't make sense. Nothing Ryan was saying was clicking with reality. I wondered what he'd meant earlier when he said the ridge was strange. "This is a secret," Ryan said, his voice dropping even lower. "It's not supposed to be told to outsiders." "Damn it, Ryan!" I yelled, my voice cracking with frustration. He wouldn't look up. He looked like he was playing a prank, but then I noticed his shoulders were shaking. He was trembling. "There's a part of the story that didn't make sense," he whispered. "So I asked about it, and then they told me the ward, the thing you say when it comes for you." "Ryan, what the hell is wrong with you? Why are you telling me this now? Can't you see the road is messed up?" I was borderline hysterical. "That's why, when things get like this, you have to say it," Ryan muttered. He began to chant, a rhythmic, sing-song cadence that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Hi-ho, hi-ho, where is your arm? Where is your leg? Prop up the pillar, hold up the ledge. Hi-ho, hi-ho." It felt like someone had poured ice water directly into my chest. My skin crawled, and a physical wave of dread washed over me. The words hi-ho echoed in my skull like a physical weight. "Hi-ho, hi-ho," he whispered over and over. I gripped the steering wheel with everything I had, staring straight ahead, trying to focus on the road. Slowly, the oppressive fog in my mind began to lift. "Please," Ryan said, his voice finally breaking. He pressed his hands together in a desperate prayer and went silent. A moment later, the road suddenly opened up. We were back on the wide, familiar highway leading into the city. Neither of us said a word until we pulled into the parking lot of a brightly lit 24-hour restaurant. Ryan finally looked at me. His face was ghostly pale. He told me that back on the ridge he'd seen a face. It was peeking through the tiny gap between the passenger door and the frame. He said his talking had stopped because he'd seen a pale, flattened face crawling up from the bottom of the door, grinning at him with a wide, mocking leer. He realized then that we were in serious trouble. He hadn't been telling me the story to scare me. He'd been staring that thing down, reciting the family ward to keep it from coming inside the car. "It's a prayer for when someone in my family is in danger," he explained. "You should go to a church or something when you get home, just to be safe." I tried to laugh it off, though my hands were still shaking. "I never knew you believed in that kind of superstitious stuff," I said, trying to sound casual. Ryan looked at me with a hollow, haunted expression. "I dug it up," he said. "I dug under the stone." Chapter 7. The Unspoken Name. In that house, names were never spoken. It wasn't because they were unnecessary. It was because they were forbidden. I had traveled to a remote town deep in the foothills of the ridge to handle a series of estate disclaimers. It was a peculiar case, a long-standing family line where every potential heir was flatly refusing to sign for their inheritance. Please do not write any names on these documents. That was the first thing the patriarch of the family, a man named Mr. Thorne, told me. Don't write them. If they are called, the cycle continues. In the main parlor, 3 heavy, ornate memorial cabinets stood side by side against the far wall. "You've had quite a few losses in the family recently," I remarked, noting how new the wood looked. "They aren't necessarily gone," Thorne said quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "They were simply called." I struggled to grasp his meaning, but before I could ask for clarification, a voice drifted in from the adjoining room. "Yes." It was a short, low sound, the tone of someone answering a summons. Thorne stood up abruptly and slid the heavy oak door shut, cutting off the sound. "That was the ear," he whispered. I stayed at a small inn on the outskirts of town that night. In the middle of a deep, restless sleep, I heard someone call my name. It was so clear and distinct that I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. Resting on my nightstand was a single sheet of paper that hadn't been there when I went to bed. I turned on the lamp, but the page was completely blank. The next morning, I went to the county records office to verify the family's genealogy. When the clerk handed me the files, I saw something I had never encountered in all my years of legal work. The birth dates and relationships were all there, but the column for names was a mess of heavy black redactions. "What is the meaning of this?" I asked. "It's so they can't be called," the clerk replied, her voice devoid of emotion as she continued filing papers. "Long ago, that family leased their names to the ridge." "Leased them?" I asked, a cold dread settling in my stomach. "They gave the woods their names in exchange for keeping the shadows away from their door," she explained. A terrible intuition drove me back to the Thorne estate. The moment the patriarch saw me, his face paled. "You've been called, haven't you? In your sleep. The dream is only the beginning." He walked to the parlor and opened one of the memorial cabinets. Inside, there was no urn, no photo, and no memento. There was only a single wooden plaque with a name scrawled on it, then violently crossed out with thick black ink. "As long as the name is hidden, the cycle stops," he said. "But the call, it always finds the next in line." Behind me, I heard the sound of someone drawing a sharp, ragged breath. "Next." Thorne bowed his head deeply. "That is why we are all refusing the inheritance," he whispered. "We are trying to break the chain. We are trying to ensure the names are never passed on." In that moment, the truth hit me like a physical blow. In this house, the inheritance wasn't the land, the house, or the family wealth. It was the debt of the name. It was the right to be the one who answers when the ridge calls. I left the town that afternoon without a single signature. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I was miles past the county line. But a few days later, a thick envelope arrived at my office from the local municipal building. Additional documentation required for estate processing, the cover letter read. Attached was a single legal form with a line prepared for a signature. My full name was already typed into the box, clear and unmistakable. I had been called once. For the Ridge, that was more than enough. Chapter 8. The Library in the Rain. Hey, do you know the story? They say there's a ghost who lives inside the books in this library. Every time it rains, I can still feel those cold fingertips. I remember the smell of old paper and that heavy, damp air thick with the scent of mildew. This happened 15 years ago, back when I was still trying to find a place where I belonged. I was an outsider in my own class. I wasn't bullied exactly. I was just invisible, like I was made of glass and everyone was looking right through me. My only sanctuary was the old public library down by the stone bridge. There, among the shadows of the stacks, I found someone else who was just as invisible as I was. It was a day of torrential rain, right before summer break. I was heading for my favorite spot, the window seat at the very back of the library. But someone was already there. It was a girl who looked a few years older than me, wearing a plain white sundress. She was turning the pages of an old leather-bound book, her head tilted as if she were listening to the rhythm of the rain against the glass. "Oh, sorry," I said. "I usually sit here." She looked up, her eyes wide with a strange kind of wonder. "You can see me?" she asked. Her gaze was distant, like she was lost in a deep fog. "That's rare," she whispered, "especially since I'm the library ghost. I only appear in this world when someone is reading." Being just a kid, I didn't doubt her for a second. Her arms were so thin they looked like they might snap, and her skin was a translucent, ghostly white. To me, she looked exactly like a spirit that had stepped right out of a fairy tale. From that day on, whenever it rained, we met in that corner. We didn't talk much. We just sat side by side and read our books. But we had a little ritual before I had to head home. We'd make handmade bookmarks and tuck them into the books we'd finished, trading them back and forth. "Here," she said one afternoon, handing me a slip of cardstock. "I made this one for you." Her bookmarks were always crafted from old cereal boxes or pressed leaves she'd found, carefully decorated by hand. They were my greatest treasures. I didn't care who or what she really was. In a world that ignored me, she was the only one who saw me. That was enough. "Hey," I asked her as I was leaving, "will you be here tomorrow? Do you think it'll rain?" "I hope it does," she replied softly. "If it rains, I don't have to disappear." But at the end of that summer, our time together was cut short. The library was slated for a massive renovation and was closed indefinitely due to its age. Panicked, I ran to the library even though the sun was shining, but the entrance was already cordoned off with bright yellow caution tape. I couldn't get inside. I realized then that I didn't have a phone number or an address for a library ghost. I saw an old man working near the gate and called out to him. "Excuse me, do you know the girl who was always in there? The beautiful one in the white dress?" "A girl?" he asked, looking at me with pity. "No, son. This place has been locked up for a week. There's nobody in there. You should head home before you get into trouble." After that, I came down with a terrible fever. I was bedridden and delirious for a week, and by the time I finally recovered, her name had slipped through the cracks of my memory. I knew I had called her by name 1,000 times, and I knew it was written on the back of those bookmarks, but I couldn't bring it back. Eventually, I started telling myself that she was just a hallucination, a dream born from a lonely boy's imagination. I had to believe that because the hole she left in my heart was too deep to carry otherwise. 15 years later, I was working as an editor for a small local publishing house. My assignment was to write a feature for the final issue of a regional magazine that was folding. I had to return to that library. The building was being repurposed into a community health center, and I was sent to document its history. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. It hadn't changed. The dust and the old paper brought those damp memories rushing back to the back of my throat. My interview was with a retired woman who had been the head librarian back then. "You know, I used to come here all the time as a kid," I told her. "There's something I've always wondered about." "Oh, I remember you," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "You were the boy who always sat by the window. You were always with that girl." My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a dream. The librarian remembered her. "Where is she now?" I asked, my voice trembling. She told me she was a ghost, but I assumed she was actually... The librarian's expression suddenly darkened. She gripped her hands together in her lap, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She wasn't a ghost," she said, "but she felt like she had to be one." The reality she described was far more cruel than any ghost story. The girl had lived nearby in a house full of secrets and shadows. Her parents were monsters who kept her hidden away, starving her and refusing to let her go to school or play outside. The only place she could ever slip away to was that window seat in the library. Her parents treated her like she didn't exist, so she protected herself from the despair by believing she was a spirit. She convinced herself she was a ghost so the neglect wouldn't hurt so much. She was finally rescued right before the construction started, the librarian told me. But her body was so frail, so broken, she passed away in the hospital that winter. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. She told me she could only meet when it rained because that was the only time her parents' guard slipped. She said she lived in the books because her real life was a living hell. And I had consumed her cries for help as if they were just part of a dark, beautiful story. The librarian reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a tattered old book. "She wanted me to give this to you," she said. She held on to it until the very end. With shaking fingers, I opened the cover. A single bookmark fell out. It was a piece of a cardboard box, decorated with a crude but vibrant drawing in crayon. On the back, I saw the name I had forgotten for 15 years, and below it, a short message. "Thank you for finding the ghost in me. Because of you, I got to be human." Outside the library window, the rain began to fall, just like it had back then. I sank to my knees and sobbed. She wasn't a ghost. She was just a girl who wanted to live in this world more than anyone else. "Hey, Ethan, what are you doing? The interview's over, right?" My coworker, a photographer named Chris, called out to me. I blinked and realized I was standing in the rain in front of the library. I was clutching the bookmark in my hand, but the girl in the white sundress was gone. "Here, I got you this to make up for the wait," Chris said, shoving a paper bag into my hand. "It's a spicy buffalo chicken sub from that deli by the station. What's with the face? You look like you're about to cry. Don't cry, just eat. Pain is proof you're still alive, right?" I took a massive bite of the sandwich. The heat was sharp and stinging, and the spice brought fresh tears to my eyes. It hurt, but it tasted wonderful. The sound of the rain continued, but the library didn't just smell like damp shadows anymore. The proof that she had truly lived was right there in my pocket. I tucked the bookmark away safely and stepped out into the downpour. I would carry the pain and the heat of this world and keep moving forward. I wanted to make sure that if I ever met her again inside the pages of a book, I could tell her with a straight face that I lived a life worth living. The echoes of these stories linger long after the voices fade. We have walked through woods that demand a tally, sailed waters that refuse to let go, and stood in libraries where the living and the dead are indistinguishable. These accounts leave us with a heavy question. How much of our world is truly ours, and how much is simply on loan from the shadows? Thank you for listening. As you return to the comfort of the familiar, take a moment to check your surroundings. Count your shadows. Listen for the sound of a name you haven't heard in years. We often assume we are the ones doing the observing, but perhaps we are merely being counted by something else. Stay safe, and remember, the ledger is never truly closed.